Hey there, welcome to my basement. So this past week we went over what it is that we're working against, what it is that we're working towards, and what it is that we're working with. And when we talked about what it is that we're working against, we talked about the heresy of good works. So the first thing we talked about was what it is that we're working against, and we discussed the heresy of good works, which can basically be described as any time where we take the things that we're doing, even when they're in ministry, even when they are good, and we put them out of alignment. We put those things above our union with Christ. We put those things first instead of second. And whenever we do that, whenever we get first things second and second things first, it throws it off and it doesn't work. I mentioned the Screwtape Letters, which is a book by C.S. Lewis, maybe my favorite book by C.S. Lewis. And you see in that book a senior demon writing letters to an inferior demon, to a demon in training. And so they're writing back and forth, and basically the senior demon is training the younger demon in how to move his human, his patient, further and further away from God and closer to hell. And one of the things that I really think is a good example and a good reminder for us from that comes in chapter 23. And the quote at the very end of the chapter says, and this is the senior demon writing to the younger demon, the demon in training, he says, "We do want, and we want very much, to make men treat Christianity as a means, preferably, of course, as a means to their own advancement, but failing that, as a means to anything, even to social justice. The thing to do is to get a man at first to value social justice as a thing which the enemy, God, demands, and then work him on to the stage at which he values Christianity because it may produce social justice." Later he says, "A moderated religion is just as good for us as no religion at all, and more amusing." What the wiser demon is telling this novice is that it's fine to let Christians get really wrapped up in something like social justice, or something that has a lot of activity, a lot of feverish activity, no matter the ministry. It's okay to let them do that, so long as somehow you can get them to place that thing above Christianity itself, so that Christianity just becomes like the stairs, the path to, whatever it is their desired outcome is in their ministry. I'll post a link to a place where you can watch that chapter in a doodle format on YouTube. I'll post that down below so you can check that out. So then if we're working away from the heresy of good works, we're working towards something like true prayer and action, or an integrated internal and external, the interior life that is properly formed and dispositioned in such a way that it overflows into the exterior, instead of getting those things out of order. Two key things here are, first, what St. Paul tells us in Thessalonians. He says to pray without ceasing, pray always, pray ceaselessly, which when I was growing up I thought was just impossible or stupid, or at least he didn't mean it the way he said it. The question then maybe is, well, how do we do this? How could we possibly pray all the time if we think that praying is only, holding a rosary in the church? Well, certainly you can't do that all the time. So this is where paragraph 901 of the Catechism comes in. It says, "Hence the laity, dedicated as they are to Christ and anointed by the Holy Spirit, are marvelously called and prepared so that even richer fruits of the Spirit may be produced in them." Here we go. "For all their works, prayers, apostolic undertakings, family and married life, daily work, relaxation of mind and body, if they are accomplished in the Spirit, indeed even the hardships of life, if patiently borne, all these become spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ." So in other words, everything we do, besides sin, can be offered up as a prayer if it's accomplished in that spirit, in the spirit of prayer. And we talked about a couple of different examples. One of my favorites that happens here in our home sometimes, not all the time, is that my wife and I will both be doing something. So maybe I'm washing the dishes and she's playing with the kids in the living room after dinner or something. And we'll both be doing our own tasks. But then there'll be a moment where we look over across the room and we catch each other's eye and we smile, and then we keep doing what it is that we were doing. Now, technically nothing is said in that moment, but a lot is said in that moment. We say things in that moment like, "I love you," and "I love you too." This is exactly how St. Ignatius of Loyola says all of our works in our life should be carried out. So that while we're doing our task, whatever it is that God has called us to, in those moments we can still glance and catch God's eye, so to speak, and smile and say, "I love you," and let him say, "I love you too," and continue going about our work. So this isn't like, we suppress all activity. It's not like we shut off all external goods. that's not what's being called for here. It's more that our heart is in that constant state of prayer, that our soul is disposed in that way, so that even while we're doing the work, even while we're really in the mix of whatever it is that we're working on, whatever it is God has called us to, that we can still be connected to Him in that moment, that we can still be communing with Him and smiling and saying things like, I love you and I love you too. So now the question is, if we're trying to move the needle further and further away from never praying and always working, closer to always praying and still sometimes working, how do we do it? Well, I'm convinced that one of the most practical things available to us in our diocese and in some other dioceses around the state and the country is the program called Prayer in Action. What makes Prayer in Action, I think, so effective is that it takes people out of their busyness, their regular schedules, not just for an afternoon event, not just for a weekend retreat, but for a whole week. And so for the whole week while you're on mission, your life is patterned on this schedule of continual prayer and action in a community setting where everyone around you is attempting to place themselves in that state of prayer, to properly tune their interior life. And you're still doing a lot of good. That's the great thing about it. It's not like we cut off all good works. You're painting houses for people. You're picking up yards. You're helping the elderly woman in town who has arthritis and can't clean her own china and put it back in the cabinet. You're helping her do that, and then you're sitting and having a conversation with her, and you're praying with her, and then you're relating that experience back to the group in the evening. So when we come back in the evening, there's sort of a retreat aspect, and everyone gets a chance to share where they recognized God's goodness in their day. So you have this whole week patterned on praying, working, reflecting on that prayer and work, sharing how God has shown Himself to you through prayer and action. And I think this program really helps solidify in a young person and in the adult chaperones a lifestyle, an actual lifestyle that can be lived out and practiced beyond that week, that is rooted in both prayer and action, in ora et labora. Now, I say that, and I also will make the disclaimer that it's not a silver bullet. Prayer and action, the program, doesn't solve all the problems of the world. I'm not suggesting that. And I also recognize that at some point, prayer and action might not be so effective, it might not be so fruitful. But I am convinced that, at least for the time being, in the busyness that we live in the distracted age that we have with our cell phones and everything else, to give our young people and to give their adult chaperones a chance for at least a week to break away from that and to live in that community of prayer and work, I think that can be really effective and really powerful for them. Any program like that helps a person move away from the busyness, away from the distracted, away from even good works, they might even be good, but away from good works that are devoid of connection with Christ, and closer to a place where their interior and exterior are harmonized, where the prayer and the action go together rather than act as like bookends, like you pray at one point and then you do a bunch of activity, and then maybe later you pray before you fall asleep or something. No, this constant stream of prayer that runs throughout our entire day. And yeah, at some points the prayer needs to become more focused, and we do have to cut off activity so that we can really enter into that moment and really be present to God. So that comes through all sorts of things, chiefly the liturgy, and then different devotions and things like that, silence, but that stream of prayer can actually go with us all day long, and that's what we're aiming for through this class and through prayer and action. The last thing I would mention is there's another book that we have been quoting a lot from called The Soul of the Apostolate, and it's one of those books that every time I go through it again, or every time I just read one or two pages, something sort of pricks my conscience and convicts me in this life of missionary service. And so I strongly suggest it to you as something that you pick up and use and get familiar with, because a strong emphasis of that book is patterned on what we're talking about here, or better yet, what we're talking about here is patterned on that book, this moving away from an emptiness of good works and closer to this constant union with Christ that does not squelch the good works, but actually improves them, actually lifts them up and elevates them to what they're called to be. So, check that out. Thanks. See ya.